everyone. My name is Ranjit Nair, and I'm the president of Stanley Black & Decker's infrastructure business. I also serve as an executive sponsor of our Asian Heritage Network Employee Resource Group, a community that encourages culture, connection, and development by embracing our Asian heritage. I'm honored to be partnering with SASE, and I'm privileged to be part of this professional development webinar series hosted by Stanley Black & Decker. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a cornerstone of our company and a personal passion of mine. Across our organization, we firmly believe together we are more and are committed to prioritizing DEI in everything we do, between holding DEI workshops, having meaningful conversations, and pursuing ambitious goals to further drive DEI. It's fantastic to see SASE's commitment to the advancement of scientists and engineers of Asian heritage, including this dynamic webinar series that encourages your professional growth and development. Our team is looking forward to furthering our relationship with SASE, including attending this year's Women's Leadership Conference and having members of our own Stanley Black & Decker team graduate from the Top Gun Leadership Academy. Thank you to the SASE team for your partnership, and on behalf of Stanley Black & Decker, we hope you enjoy today's session.
Welcome, everybody. So pleased to see now 84 people and soon to be close to 88 people here with us today. Really appreciate your time. Hope you are having a wonderful day here in Cincinnati. It is above 90 degrees, which you'd expect to be the case in August. However, it was like 75 2 days ago. So, hey, anyway, let us know where you're calling from. Toss it into the chat. I would love to see how many states we're hitting today. And in the meantime, let me talk a little bit about what's going on with SASE Pro and who we are. For anybody who this is new, who SASE Pro is new to you. So that's why we go through this. And Jessica, please tell me if you can't see my screen. So we're good. All right, awesome. So for SASE Pro, what we do and why we do it, the problem statement, so to speak. Studies show that Asians are 50% less likely to get promoted to middle management, not executive tiers, just to middle management, versus their Caucasian counterparts. And this creates an Asian leadership gap that impacts us not just individually, but it impacts companies as well. That's a huge amount of untapped potential that is not being realized today. And so what we found is that there are 4 common factors that Asian professionals generalized struggle with: lack of political and organizational savvy, cultural deference to authority, ineffective communication and influencing skills, and an aversion to risk-taking. Now, we've got some challenges to be able to tackle this to begin with. They are, frankly, awareness of this gap. Even some of the data that you are looking at, the 50% piece, that wasn't really well known until relatively recently. And definitely as I meet more and more companies, this data isn't very well understood. Fortunately, there is more and more information and data and research being done nowadays, and there's a lot more available than there was even 3 short years ago. Number 2, what to do about it. In many cases, organizations will view this as a challenge of access to high quality training, and will say, okay, we've got all this training, let's just shove more Asians into it. That could work, but in many cases it doesn't work because it doesn't land. The cultural context, by having both psychological safety as well as the cultural context, is critically important for this type of material to land. I definitely learned this through my own career, and we continue to see this as we offer programs. Lastly, let's face it, Asian development is, relatively speaking, a lower level priority. We tend to be funded a little bit less as well. From a pure numbers standpoint, I get it. From a representation standpoint across the board, our numbers don't look as bad, especially when you compare to general population. However, when you look at compared to available talent as well as progression, there's this huge untapped potential. But that's the reality that we live in, folks. So what we've done for SASE, and we have doubled these numbers, we bring together about 250 Asian ERG leaders to from almost a little over 100 companies to collaborate and develop programs for everyone. Starting with our national convention, which is coming up here in 6 weeks or 7 weeks or so. And we've got a women's conference in April, a virtual one, and then we've got year-round programs like this one here, this webinar series. So this is an ongoing free series thanks to our current sponsor, Stanley Black & Decker, whose video you just saw. This is what allows us to bring trainers in and operate and function this as a free series for all of you. Roughly every 4 weeks, and we will post the recordings on our website for at least 2 months, in many cases much longer. You can stay connected on what's coming up just from our website, or honestly just follow us on LinkedIn. That's the easiest way. We will notify you as well if you've signed up for our mailing list and for the upcoming ones. So with that, logistics wise, we've kind of streamlined this a little bit. Basically, the trainer is going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, share some fantastic information with us on the topic of choice. There will be a moderated Q&A with me. I've got some questions pre-selected, pre-written that I'll ask, and then I'm going to be watching the chat and bringing your questions into play. So please do enter those in. And with that, I want to bring up my friend, Amy Yip. I met Amy through the Asian Women Coaching Collective, organization that we've worked with very closely with for our Women's Leadership Conference. Over the past year and a half or so, Amy and we've connected. Geez, Amy, this is probably like the 4th time that we've had you come for a SASE event. And heck, we saw each other at the Ascend conference a month and change ago. So, and we will see you again at our SASE National Convention here in another 7 weeks or so. So, Amy, I don't know. I never tire of you. I don't know what's going, so that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So, Amy, I'm just going to hand it over to you, and I'm going to stop talking because people would much rather hear from you. So,
all right, let me start this. Okay, so we're gonna begin today with just a couple of slides, and then we'll get into the meat of the content. I'm struggling to move this bar. Can everyone see the slides? Okay, great. Well, I'm having technical difficulties. All right, so welcome everyone to this session on unfinished business, how to have healing conversations to bridge intergenerational gaps and attain career success and authentic connections. So as Parag said, my name is Amy Yip. I'm a certified somatic life transformation and mental fitness coach. I'm the author of the upcoming book, Unfinished Business, Breaking Down the Great Wall Between Adult Child and Immigrant Parents. I've worked over 16 years in corporate America, leading global teams at organizations like Google, Clorox, Booz Allen. That is until January 2020, when, against my parents' wishes, I quit my job at Google, sold all my belongings, and with just a backpack on my back, took a one-way flight to Ghana to volunteer at a breast cancer nonprofit and travel the world. And if many of you remember what happened in 2020, that little thing called COVID came along. I ended up getting stuck in Ghana because borders closed, and I was stuck in Ghana for 7 months. So that's a bit about my journey. I'm also certified through Hudson, Strozzi, Positive Intelligence, ICF. I am a lifelong learner. And that's actually why I love to speak. I love to train. I love coaching, because I'm always curious about the world and I want to understand people better. And that is why I'm here today. And I want to share a little story that gives you a bit of an understanding of why my journey has taken me to this point today with that book and why this topic is so important to me. So about three and a half years ago, I was working with a client. She's Chinese American. Let's just name her Lisa for right now. Chinese American, 55-year-old, senior vice president at one of the largest banks. She was not happy in her career. And so we were trying to figure out, like, what does she want to do next in her life? Through our coaching work, she discovered that she really wanted to start her own business, except it was a creative business. She said to me, Amy, I can't do it. At least not until my dad passes away. And I asked her, what makes you think that? And she said, he's always wanted me to become the president of a company. I'm only a senior vice president right now. He would be disappointed. He would be upset with me. And he would criticize me. He just won't understand it. So I'm going to wait till he passes away. As we started talking more, we started exploring, well, could you have conversations with him? And what she discovered was she goes into what she called little girl mode every single time she thought of doing something that went against her parents' expectations. And mind you, her father was 85 years old at this time. And yet she would not go in and have these conversations with him. And I started seeing this pattern among a lot of my clients, especially those who are of Asian descent. They would go into little girl, little boy mode, and yet they would be too afraid to have these conversations with their parents. I started wondering, what are the stories that I have? What are the things that I'm hiding from my parents? What are the things that I'm afraid that they would be disappointed in me about? And that's when I started on my journey of self-discovery. And I got really fascinated by this notion of intergenerational trauma. And so before we go into the book and all of those things, I want to dive into a little about intergenerational trauma. And so what we'll cover in the next 10 minutes is, what is intergenerational trauma? How can trauma be passed down? And the connection between the intergenerational trauma and career success and authentic connections. So intergenerational trauma is sometimes referred to as trans or multi-generational trauma. And essentially, it is trauma that gets passed down from those who directly experience an incident to subsequent generations. So intergenerational trauma may begin with a traumatic event that affects an individual. It could be traumatic events that affect multiple family members, or even collective trauma affecting larger communities, culturally, racial groups, ethnic groups. And so the intergenerational trauma is when the original traumatic experience is transferred from parent to children and then to grandchildren and so on. And the other thing that I want to throw in here is that what I'm sharing here, it is from my own lived experiences and my own research and learnings. I am not a therapist, so I want to throw that out there. I'm not a licensed therapist, but this is through my many years of learning, taking courses on trauma and how it gets passed down. So what are different types of intergenerational trauma? War, natural disasters, terrorism, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, right? And the trauma can be that you experienced it personally. It can also be if you witnessed it. So for example, if a child witnesses the physical abuse of their mother once or many times, this can be experienced as trauma. And so it does not have to be a direct trauma where you're actually the one receiving it. So when traumatic events happen, two things might happen to the person who experienced that incident. The first is that it might produce changes to an individual's biology and genetic makeup. For example, studies have shown that trauma can impact the cortisol level in the person who experienced it. The other way that it could impact the person who's experienced it is that you end up developing adaptive characteristics. So for example, if you got physically abused or hit when you were seen and heard, you might have learned to shrink yourself. You might have learned to stay quiet. You might have learned not to ask for what you want. might have learned not to speak up. And that gets carried into other parts of your life. It could be your career, it could be with a boss, where you're not even interacting with that person who abused you, but it's an adaptive survival strategy that you've taken on into other parts of your life. And there's actually a clinical psychologist, her name is Yael Danieli, and she studied Holocaust survivors and their children. And what she found was there are 4 adaptive styles among survivors. And those adaptive styles are numbing, victim, fighter, and those who made it. So essentially, survivors who become numb seek silence, they self-isolate, right? They don't like stimulation of any kind. And typically, they're minimally involved when they're raising their own kids. Victim adaptive style have fear, distrust of the outside world. They try to remain inconspicuous, and they're often depressed and will quarrel with people. And then you have the fighters, and the fighters will try to succeed at all costs, right? They have this armor of strength, and it makes them very intolerant of weakness or self-pity. And then lastly, those who made it, that's typically characterized by pursuit of socioeconomic successes. And they will intentionally distance themselves both from the experience of the trauma and from other survivors if it's a group experience. So how does this trauma get transmitted to the child? We know the traumatic event happens. It could impact the individual's genetic makeup. It could impact their adaptive characteristics. There's still this question that's out there: is it nature or nurture? And the research is suggesting that it's both. So studies have demonstrated that traumatic events can actually cause the transmission to the children. So parents can transmit their inborn genetic vulnerabilities to their children. So there was a study done on women who were exposed to the World Trade Center collapse on 9/11. And what they found is the infant children of these women, along with these women, they had cortisol levels that were lower than normal. And so it got transmitted. Another way that trauma can be passed down is through parenting styles. So survivors develop an adaptation style, perhaps the numbing, the fighter, something else. And that is how they end up parenting their child. So they're ultimately creating a certain environment for their children to grow up in. And I want to point out that while the existence of the research on intergenerational trauma is really well documented, there's still not full clarity on, well, which one is it? Is it the genetics? Is it the nature? Or is it the nurture, the environment? And how do those interplay? And how can you figure out which one is which? So there's no clear evidence yet, but they do know that the genetics do impact you, environment does impact you. And I guess the answer from all the research is, well, it depends. So, but what we do know is that ultimately children experience and understand the world. Like if you have kids yourself, or you thought about when you were a kid, we all understood the world through our interactions with our caregivers, whether that's our parents or someone else, right? And we tend to model their behavior. We mimic their behavior. I have an 18-month-old, and when I say something, he'll copy what I'm saying, or when I do something, he'll mimic what I'm doing, right? So that's one effect on the children. We're mimicking and modeling the behavior that the parent is showing up with. The other thing is that we learn to navigate our relationships in the future based on how we relate to our parents. So how we learn to cope with and relate to our parents, it's often driven by wanting to avoid or wanting to fix our parents' behavior, if it's anger or depression or abuse or neglect. And we learn that behavior, and that impacts how we relate to people in the future, whether it's personal or professional relationships. And what ends up happening is we could develop coping mechanisms, uncontrollable anger. It could be drug or alcohol misuse. It could be struggling to have close, meaningful relationships because there's this barrier, right? Or we might even be hyper vigilant all the time and looking for danger signs. And that's the impact that it has. And then it gets passed on, right? Because if that's how you're growing up and that's what you're learning, you then keep passing it on. And that's why it's called intergenerational trauma. It continues and continues until someone stops it. And so, trauma makes us always on the lookout for danger signs. And when that happens, we struggle to know what we need. We struggle to know what we value and what we want to be able to engage in. And ultimately, that leads to an inability to speak up, an inability to ask for what you want, an inability to speak for what you need in a job, in a relationship, right? Inability to open up, relate, connect to others. And in a lot of the corporate environment, that's important. We need to be able to speak up for what we need, what we value. We need to be able to engage with other people. And so these are important things to keep in mind. The other thing that is fascinating is that a lot of the research is being done on, okay, so we know intergenerational trauma is happening. How do we actually help people heal? Right? What do we do to actually stop it from being passed on from generation to generation? And some of the approaches and types of programs that they're using to help people move through this, one of them is to acknowledge and understand the family's history of trauma. And having grown up in a very traditional Chinese household, I know that this is something that is very hard, at least for my parents and my grandparents to do, is to acknowledge and to speak truth to what has happened in our history, right? All the famine, all the stuff that happened to them. But that is one way to heal. Another way is to reconnect to your culture and group identity, which for many of us being in America, but of a different culture, could be also something that could be challenging. In my book, I have a chapter about a sense of belonging. Over here, I don't feel like I'm American enough. People always ask me, well, where are you really from? And then when I go to China, or anywhere in Asia, they're like, oh, you're American. You're not really Chinese or, whatever it is. And so it's about how do you reconnect to your culture and identity and figuring out what that identity is. And the last piece is focusing on the communal healing, family involvement, and building those strong bonds and attachment with family, which, for me and my parents, it was definitely not a strong bond for much of my life. And so after learning about intergenerational trauma and all this work that's happening, I started to ponder two questions. And these are questions that you can also think about. One is, what happened before I was born? What happened before I was born? And the second question is, did my parents or grandparents experience trauma or traumatic life? Did my parents or grandparents or even my great-grandparents experience trauma or traumatic life? And that led me to thinking about, well, what do I wish to understand about my parents? What is it that I want to understand about my parents? And that was how my book started. My book, which is about the healing journey with my parents. Over the past three years, I've spent 40 plus hours in conversations with my parents about the history, about the stories that I had in my head, about what I thought about my parents, or who they were, or what they thought about me, or whether they were proud of me or not. So all of these things. And that's how I started on my journey. And I will say that even though my relationship with my parents is completely different now, the first 25 hours of those 40 hours of conversation were so hard. I would come home in tears. There would be a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, a lot of feelings like, oh, they're just always criticizing me. I don't want to do this anymore. And if it wasn't for my husband who kept pushing me, and my husband, by the way, is a white guy, his family's from Wisconsin. So very, very different upbringing than mine. He would constantly encourage me to keep doing this and to keep going and give me hugs when I needed to. So that's how the book was born. And what I learned during this journey is, one is by understanding my parents' history, I have more clarity on what is mine and what is not. I've learned a lot about the trauma that my parents have been through, how that's impacted, and what I want to stop here, right? What I don't want to pass on to my kid. I have an 18-month-old, and he's a big motivator for me wanting to do this work. The second thing that I learned is that just by listening to their stories, my parents have started to heal. And I actually did not even know this. So this isn't even in my book, because by the time my book went to the printing press and all that stuff, like I didn't realize that my parents were healing in so many ways. But my dad has started swimming every day. And I couldn't even get him to go outside to walk. Right. So now he picks up all his swim gear and goes to the pool and swims a couple laps every single day, unless it's storming outside. And my mom, who she went through so much as a kid and she forgot how to play. She's actually playful now. She makes jokes. And I'm like, who are you? So, in many respects, by listening to my parents' story, I gave them a gift of healing. And then the third thing that I learned is that who my parents are today is not who they were before. And when I say before, I mean the stories that I had about who my parents were all based on my childhood. They were all from when I was 5 or 10 years old, and my parents would yell at me or lecture me and tell me things. And the thing is, human beings change. We all have changed, and so have our parents. Right? My parents are in their 70s. They have changed from who they were 35 years ago. And so the stories that I had about who they were not all true. And so by listening and learning about our parents and their experiences and their beliefs, we get to know who they are today versus who they used to be. And so all of this has gone into my book, which is coming out on September 28th. The book delves into all of the myths, and I call them myths, the myths that I had about my parents, everything from my success will never be good enough for my parents, to I can never repay them for their sacrifices, to it's better to be a boy than a girl because I was born as an accident and I was the third daughter. So when my mom was pregnant with me, my dad had said, this one has to be the boy. We're going to keep it. It's going to be the boy. And then out I came. So I have a whole chapter on just the gender piece also. So this, I'll pause there so that, and invite Parag to join me.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Amy. That was phenomenal. There's some amazing comments going on already with lots of upvotes and whatnot like that. Please, share your thoughts into the chat. This is obviously very important information or important topics. And, one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking is, one of the other, I don't know if it's what I learned or not, but as our parents pass on, right? If we don't get their stories, they're gone. And I've got this one of our family friends from when we moved to a small town in Eastern Kentucky. That's a different story for a different webinar. The guy who kind of got us to move there back in the late 70s, he's a Holocaust survivor. He's 95, and we're seeing the uptick of Holocaust denials, and there's plenty that has been shared about the Holocaust, right? But think about all the different traumas that our Asian community across the 49 countries has immigrated with. It's not one Asian experience, right? It's 49 different cultures, but then even beyond that, the number of different types of iterations of, time periods and this and that, the other, and we don't talk about it. And it's not really something that's captured or even discussed in many American history books, right? And so there's even that. I mean, what you have learned and uncovered and from your own parents' history, that's something that you'll be able to pass on to your kids. And and document. And so, yeah, fantastic. Seriously.
Thank you. Yeah,
I know that wasn't a question, but yeah, go ahead.
No, I saw a comment in here about if you look back 2, 3, or even more generations, practically every family has experienced trauma in some manner. Yeah, it is called human existence. That is true. And there's also, so you can't compare experiences, and some cultures are just more open to speaking about things versus not. And at least in my family, I don't want to speak for everyone, but in my family, we just didn't speak about it. It was this unspoken thing, you don't talk about it. And I think also a lot of Asian history just isn't talked about. Like my high school history book had this much, a small paragraph on Japanese internment. My husband, who he did not know about all this stuff. It wasn't until the AAPI hate that was happening and I was getting really emotional where we were like this. And I said, you don't ever understand me. And it made me question, like, should I have listened to my parents and married a good Chinese boy who would get it? Like, and he did his homework. He watched all these documentaries and everything. He's like, wow, I never learned any of that in history. So there's almost like this quietness and this non-acknowledgement that makes it worse.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great example, is the internment. Where I grew up, it wasn't crystal clear that was a bad thing. It wasn't made very crystal clear. It was talked about kind of loosely, but it wasn't made exactly crystal clear that was a bad thing, and so forth. So I completely agree with you. The adaptation styles that you talked about, numb, victim, fighter, those who made it. It sounds like many of those, as you were saying, is really based off of those are kind of individual types of reactions, right? Is there a cultural element that you were able to find, or that hasn't quite been teased out yet?
I never teased. I wasn't able to tease that out. I mean, I could point out characteristics, whether it's like my own personal family, but I don't want to. The research hasn't shown anything.
The research hasn't. Yeah, that makes sense. So, when you first started down this path, can you walk us through what that first conversation with your parents was? I mean, certainly looking back now 3 years, where you are today, as you mentioned, is so different. But how did you even approach it? Did you tell them, hey mom and dad, I want to learn about your history? And I mean, based off what you shared, that would be kind of out in left field. So how did you go, or how would you even recommend to somebody to even start this?
Yeah. So I'll share my experience and then how you can start it. So at the time, it was during COVID. And as I mentioned, I was stuck overseas. And I decided that I wanted to have these conversations. The one thing also is I was also afraid, because this was the period when a lot of the AAPI hate stuff was happening. I was afraid of what would happen to my parents. They're also not the healthiest. Well, my mom isn't the most healthiest. And so that question, to your point of what if something happens to them during COVID, right? So I have to do this. I'm not going to wait till I get back to the US. I have to do this. And so I called my parents and I was like, hey, so I'm curious about your life story, and I'd love to just document our family history and learn more. And when I posed that question, my dad said, oh, we don't have anything important to share. We don't have important stories, nothing exciting here. We were just restaurant workers. You should call your uncle. He's a lawyer. I'm sure he's got lots of things to share with you. And I was like, no, I want to learn about you, not uncle. And so they were a bit hesitant at first. And I tried going with the deeper questions, didn't work. So I actually reversed back. And I started with just very, very simple questions. Like I called them up and I'm like, hey, so what would you like to eat when you were a kid? What was your favorite food? What was your favorite mom's dish? How did you play as a kid? What was your favorite color? Because I didn't know what my parents' favorite color was. So I would ask those easier questions to warm them up before going a little deeper. And so for people who want to embark on this journey of conversation with their parents, I would say it depends on where you are with your parents in terms of your relationship. I have had a conversation just the other day with someone who has not spoken to his father in 5 years. He was like, what do I do? And so if it is, you haven't spoken to your parents in a long time, think about why you want to have the conversation. What kind of relationship do you want with your parents, right? What difference do you want to make? Having a strong why will keep you motivated and strong throughout this. There's that great book, Start with Why, right? Like, why do you want this? And then go to your parents and tell them, like, hey, I know we haven't spoken in X amount of time. This is the sort of relationship that I want. Insert type of relationship, would you be open to that? And be ready for, they might say no, they might say yes, and they might say maybe, but at least you're being vulnerable instead of just asking them, because something that he had thought was like, oh, I'll just go ask them. So what kind of relationship do you want with me? He's like, I'll just call them and ask that. I'm like, I don't know, that might be putting them on the spot,
Right.
So it's being really clear what kind of relationship you want with them. If you have a very close relationship, just ask. And if you're kind of in the middle ground where your parents are probably going to say, no, thanks, I don't want to share my stories, then don't even ask. It might be you're on the phone with them and you could say, oh, my son is really into, I don't know, strolling things around and moving things around in trucks these days. I'm so curious, what did you love to play with when you were his age, right? And so you can throw things into conversations without making it like this official conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm going to guess, obviously haven't read your book yet because it hasn't come out. I believe I pre-ordered it, but I need to double check that. I'm going to guess that your book actually could create another avenue to start that conversation. Oh, hey, mom, dad, I was reading this book and it's fascinating. This made me wonder, whatnot. So we can kind of use you as a crutch now.
Yes, you can say, hey, I was reading this book. This lady was talking to her parents and I thought it'd be cool to get to know you. And she has questions in the book, because that's the other thing is in the book, every single chapter has worksheets. I call it a date with your parents. And there are self-reflective prompts where you can do self-reflection. There are questions to ask your parents, and I set them as like, here are the light ones, and then here are the deeper ones, just depending on where you are in your conversations. And then there's a post reflection. And so you can use these and be like, hey, I was reading this book and there are these cool worksheets, and can we do them?
We didn't even plan that question, but now I kind of feel like we should have planned it, because that was almost too much of a layup. So, even if we peel back, I mean, in my mind, one of the super fascinating things about your history is that you just kind of picked up and went to Ghana, right? And when we were chatting, that was an interesting conversation in itself. Could you share more about how that went, and honestly, how you think you'd go if you were to do that now with them?
So I had always had dreams to go travel the world, to volunteer. And actually, originally, when I was planning on doing this, I had mocked up an entire plan, right? I was like, all right, so here's some FAQs, here's the plan. And I called both of my sisters and I said, okay, so I'm going to tell parents that I got a job overseas, and it's this really hard to get job. So it's almost like getting a promotion, right? Like it's prestigious. And I'm going to block all my family and friends that they know on all my social media. I won't post on it, but that's what we're going to tell them, that I'm overseas doing this thing. And both my sisters agreed to it, right? And so I actually told my parents, I was like, yeah, I got this job, I'm going to be leaving. And they were kind of like, oh, that's so far, but we're so excited for you. And then my sister went and told on me. My middle sister went and told my parents, she doesn't really have a job. She's just quitting her job and she's going to go travel the world. And my mom called me and was livid. And she was so angry, and I was really pissed at my sister. And there is like my sister and I have this competitive nature. And so, yeah. But that led to the day before my wedding, I broke down in tears. So the day before my wedding, I cried, and my mom was there. And she was like, "What's wrong?" And I told my mom, "I just feel like I have disappointed you on so many levels, right? I'm about to get married to this white guy, and you always wanted me to marry an Asian guy. I'm about to quit my job at this prestigious company. You're not happy with that. And I'm going to go volunteer and make no money. And I feel like I just let you down on so many levels." And I just bawled and bawled. And my mom, and she, like, I still remember that moment, she just pulled me in, and I was shocked because like she's showing me affection. She pulled me into her arms and just held me, and I was just like bawling, all snotty faced on her shoulder. And she said, "Amy, I will never understand your dreams, but you don't need me to understand your dreams. I love you, and that's all that needs to matter. You don't need people to understand what you want and your dreams and the things you want to go after." And she's like, "I love you. I'm if it makes you happy, I still love you, but I'm gonna be worried about you over there because that's my job as a mom." And she's like, "And Greg, he's cool." So Greg's my husband. So yeah, and I still really, really remember that moment. And that was another point in my life where I was like, I want a different relationship with my parents. Like, I know it's in them. I know there's love in them. I know they have affection in them. It's just yeah, they've learned to armor themselves. So
Wonderful. Do you, I mean, that sounds pretty transformative even for your mom. I would imagine that there was some element in there that it was like, okay, do I go left or do I go right for her to even respond in that way? Or do you think it was actually there the entire time, but just how she projected it? Like, do you think it was a moment for her where she realized, holy cow, what am I doing? Or was it more of a oh no, this is how I've always felt? Or I don't know if that makes sense.
yeah, I mean, I truly believe, okay, where do I begin with this? I truly believe that all of our parents have deep emotions. They all have a desire to be, to be in physical connection with other human beings. We were all born that way. You look at babies, that's what we crave, physical touch, and we are very expressive with our feelings. But at some point, we learned to numb all that, right? By our environment. We learned it was not okay. And, if you want to be a good child, don't show emotion. Or if you want to be a good kid, don't do that. And so we learned how to show up in the world. But it is all still there. All we've done is we've armored up. And I was like that too for a lot of my career. I had an armor on. I would not be sharing any of this. And actually, during my time at Google, there were a couple of people that said, "Oh, she's such a bee," and I was like, "Well, I'm a bee. I'm so kind. I bake for you. I'm like Betty Crocker. What are you talking about?" And it was because I had this armor on, so people didn't know who was really beneath it. So it's almost like, how do you get them to take that armor off and really be human again? And even my dad, when I was writing the book, my dad cried. I've never seen my dad cry in all of his life. And we were talking about his own father and his upbringing, and he started tearing up. And my mom's like, "Ooh, old man, are you about to cry?" And my dad's like, "No, and he was turning away. And I ran up to him and I gave him a hug, and it just unleashed. It just like started unleashing, and he started bawling, and it released something in him. But it was something that needed to be released.
Thank you for that. That's fantastic. Ning Chai asks, if you realize that there were traumas for your parents for the parents due to just the time that they experienced, war and social issues and cultural changes and so forth, what do you do? Do you cope with it? Do you ignore it? Do you reconcile it? And what should you do, or what should your parents do?
Yeah. So one of the things is acknowledging that it has happened, right? So it's actually being able to speak about the thing helps you to move past it. So that is one. Another thing to be able to do is, so I'm a somatic coach, and somatic coaching is really around recognizing the energy that's in our body. So a lot of times in trauma, energy gets stuck in the body. So it might be working. There are somatic therapists. There are body workers that work on that type of energy. So it's being able to work through whatever it is that's within you. And it honestly, it depends on how deeply embedded this is. But I would always recommend getting help, getting therapy, being able to speak about it, talk about it. Talk therapy is a thing because talking about things helps you to heal.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. Jenny Chan, actually, I think it may have been Jenny Tran, my apologies. Yep, Jenny Tran, I read it wrong. Asks, when starting these conversations, did you ever feel a disconnect between what your parents would say versus their actions? For example, your parents say they're proud of what you've done after pivoting careers, but they only tell other people about the career you left behind because it was more successful or more glamorous, or it rhymes with frugal. That was a pretty good one. How did you handle this?
So it's yes. And I mean, my dad used to hand my Google business card out. He would one day I was at work and I got an email from Bank of America to Mr. Yip. And I was like, why am I getting an email from Bank of America? Apparently my dad was handing my card around and telling people, you could use this email to contact me. And I'm like, so definitely. And it's recognizing that their actions may not align to what they're really feeling.
Mm.
Right? And it's getting to know them as human beings, that they still have this deeply embedded fear of needing to have face or needing to prove their own worth. That's something that they have to work on themselves. But what is that truth? And the truth is, if they've said, I am proud of you, right? They are proud of you. And it's almost, it's something that they have to work through on their own. It's kind of like, and we all do it as human beings. We say one thing, but we do something else, but we do it for a certain reason. And usually it is fear. And for our parents, it's the same thing. It's being afraid that they're not good enough as parents or whatever it is.
Yeah, no, I love that business card thing. My own parents my mom and my dad have very different reactions to choices that I've made in my career. I remember having a conversation with my parents once that I didn't want to be promoted anymore, that I was happy where I was. I didn't want the more responsibility and whatnot. And my mom was flipped out almost as much as she would. And it came down to being able to brag to her family and social circle and whatnot, because that's important. Status is important. But then after I explained it to her, I was like, okay, do you want me to make more money or do you want me to be happy? And she was like, well, of course I want you to be happy. And I was like, okay, I don't want to put in all the hours. I don't want to pull in all that stress and so forth. And so that was moment number one. And then certainly when I left my corporate job and pseudo retired early, and then I ended up here with things doing nonprofit work. But it's the same exact thing. My dad was like, oh, that's the coolest thing ever. He was super happy. My mom was extremely concerned. And it varies by person. It varies on their by Asian parent on how they react. And one of the things we talked about was you were doing this for, in part, because you were approaching parenthood and you wanted to better understand what's all going on. And anything you can remember about how you had been thinking about approaching parenting that has changed as a result of this process?
I actually got pregnant in the midst of this. So I started this journey, didn't know that I was pregnant, and then I found out I was pregnant, and then, and then had my kid during this. And it has impacted both how I parent, but also my relationship with my parents, my own parents, and how I am a kid with them. Because, and with my parents, the change is that after I had my child, I went back and listened to some of the recordings with my parents that I had done. And I heard my tone, and I was kind of a jerk, right? I could hear my tone to them. And I was like, if my son talked to me like that, that would be so hurtful. And so right now I'm much more cognizant of how am I speaking to my parents. In terms of with my son, one of the things that my dad told me is that his biggest regret is that he did not spend enough time with his girls. He was like, now looking back, I probably didn't have to work 2 jobs. Your mom didn't have to work 2 jobs, but we thought we had to at the time. We were so afraid of not being able to feed our daughters, clothe our daughters, have a roof over our heads. So we just worked. And next thing you know, we open our eyes and our girls are gone. They've moved out of the house. They're adults, and we missed that whole childhood. And he's like, if I could turn back time, that's what I would change. And so now with my kiddo, I am very intentional that I want to be present with him. When he was born, I fell so in love with him that I decided, you know what, I'm going to cut back on my coaching. I'm going to cut back on my work, and I'm only going to do part-time stuff. And I want to spend as much time with him as possible, because I don't want to have that same regret. And even though, sometimes we know we're supposed to, but we still don't. After the conversations with my parents, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm going to do that.
That's a great example. That's a fantastic example. My own dad, he and my mom had a conversation, and he decided, not just from a providing standpoint, but from a greater good standpoint, to spend as much time as he could at the hospital, because we were in an medically underserved area. He was the only surgeon in the area. So, but they made that decision, and my dad has expressed the exact same regret of, everything with raising the kids, the 3 of us, was left to my mom. And my dad and I, he didn't have as close of a relationship as a result. And I know he regretted that. I know he, definitely felt some regrets as a result. And I don't have kids, but my brother and my sister do. And it absolutely has impacted their approach of not wanting to take the same thing. And you mentioned that as far as, reactions to those types of traumas and so forth. So yeah, folks, if you've got any questions, feel free to put it into the chat. One of the things we also talked about was how growing up, if you wanted to do something that your parents wouldn't approve of how you approach that with, lying or hiding things or whatnot. Can you say a little bit more about what you've learned through this process about, even that?
One of the biggest changes that I've seen in my parents is my ability to share. So I've been going through fertility treatments, right? And I have frozen embryos. I'm much older now. So I'm like, all right, got to have the second kid, or, getting old, all those shoulds that are given in the world. And so I've been going through fertility treatments, getting having embryo transfers. And in May, I went through a transfer and it failed. And my parents knew that I was going through these embryo transfers, but I was really, really afraid to tell them, hey, it didn't work. Because when my sister had miscarriages, they blamed her. They said, must have been something you did that caused you to have a miscarriage. So when my dad called, I was so scared. He was like, oh, how are things going? When do you find out if you're pregnant? And I already knew that it was unsuccessful. So my whole body just clenched up. It went into, fight, flight, freeze mode, and I couldn't breathe. And I was like, oh shoot, should I tell them? Should I not? Should I lie about something? Because I was really afraid that they would blame me. But instead I said, didn't work. No baby. And I was like bracing myself for my dad to blame me. And instead he goes, you know, fate, sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. Don't blame yourself. You know, things will be okay. If you're meant to have the kid, you'll have the kid. And then my mom got on the phone. I was like, oh shit, she's gonna say something. But then she's like, Amy, are you okay? Do you need anything? Don't be sad, don't cry. It'll be okay, right? And I was like, who are these people? Because yeah, and I was just in shock about the fact that I didn't have to lie and that they really just were there for me emotionally for it.
That's the way I did it. I'm the third of 3 kids, so I'm the baby, right? And my brother and my sister were always mad at me because I seemed to get away with a lot more. And the way I did it is, I would, I think somebody put it into the chat, I'd just do it and then, ask for forgiveness instead of permission, or I'd rationalize it like, I would just rationalize with them like, hey, in however many years I'm going to be out of the house, would you rather me experiment while I'm under your roof, or would you rather me do it when I'm away? And so I would rationalize things with them, and then we're like, oh, that's a good point. All right, fine. But it was definitely a very different approach versus those that were in the community with me. So, we are approaching time. I am going to share my screen again, but before I get into this, so Jessica, if you can toss up the poll, I'd appreciate it. Amy, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. The time has flown. I think you can tell from the chat that, there are lots of people who can resonate very closely with everything you've shared. Thank you for taking the steps that you did. I know initially you weren't necessarily doing it for the broader community, but by writing your book, no doubt it's going to enable a ton of those types of conversations. It's coincidental in a sense because we've been internally within SASE also been talking about very similar things about the need to have these types of conversations with our parents. And I'm excited that now we've got a framework to be able to use. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to answer one question that's in the chat, which is
sure.
To remind my parents to treat my sisters, kindly too, and why the different treatment from my sister. So my sister's miscarriage was from 7 or 8 years ago. It was before I had these conversations with my parents. It was before my parents started recognizing their own stuff and before they did their healing work. And I say healing work because they've never had anybody sit there and listen to their stories. Yeah. Right. And that's what I did. I listened to them and just listened to their stories. I wasn't in it for them to understand me. I wasn't in it for them to change. That was not my goal. It was purely to listen. And through that, they have healed, they have changed, and they are much more affectionate and all of that to both of my sisters. They have told my sisters what they're proud of, what they love them for. Right. So it's not just been changing with me, but also with my sisters.
Wow. Your sisters, they totally owe you. I mean, you are like holding this over their heads, right? Like, hey, The
awesome thing is I recorded these conversations. So when my dad said, oh, I'm proud of this sister for this or this sister for this, I took the recording to my sisters. And I'm like, guess what? Mommy and daddy said they're proud of this. To let them hear it. And I'm sure they didn't express anything. They're like, oh, cool. But I'm sure that it felt so nice to hear that your parents are proud of you.
You're absolutely right. So, okay. We are almost at time. Folks, you can go to saseconnect.org/webinar and sign up for our upcoming webinar in September with Laura Flessner about using innovative leadership to break bias and unleash your potential. Again, we've got a webinar every month for the most part, except in October because we've got our national convention and STEM career fair. There are 2.5 days of professional programming. There's also a day of collegiate programming as well as a collegiate STEM career fair. 600 some Asian professionals, might be even closer to 700. We've got close to 70 senior Asian executives who have signed up, 12 trainers, 8 tracks of programming, 32 workshops, 16 executive panels. I'm just reading off this screen. But what that tells you, there's a lot of different options, a lot of different sessions. Every attendee will have a customized experience based off what they want to participate in. That's the goal here. It is to have very intimate conversations on topics that are relevant to you. Registration is open, $950 a person. Believe me, over half of that goes straight to food. Bulk purchases are also available. Just reach out to us at pro@saseconnect.org if you are interested. More information, our website. Follow us on LinkedIn. We publish everything there. We put lots of information out there, and we've got lots of opportunities for ERGs to engage with us. So if your ERG, Employee Resource Group, is not connected with us, please reach out to us at pro@saseconnect.org. There are no membership fees or commitments or costs. We do this for the broader community, and we're use registrations to cover our bills, of course. With that, thank you so much. It is 5 o'clock Eastern, and we hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of the week. See you next time, folks.